So we got 3 worksheets. We're not going to fill out everything like we did for photosynthesis. That's not necessary. We want to do the main things. We're going to do the highlight reel of these worksheets. So find the one that says Glycolytic Pathway on it. So you go out on the internet, you can find the answers to this because, I mean, it's where I got it. Here's the answers right here. But we're not really interested in that. That doesn't do you any good. You got to know kind of what's what and what's going on. So we're going to label just key things in here. And I think you'll get a lot more out of it that way. So first thing, being this is respiration, what molecule would this probably be? We actually had to model this back in Chapter 6 when we went through and did all that stuff. What do your cells need for energy? What's that? Okay, it needs oxygen. What would this molecule be? So there's 6 carbons, there's an oxygen, there's some hydrogens. What's that? Blood sugar, starts with a G, glucose. There we go. I've gone through this thing so many times, it's obvious to me. I know it's not to you guys. Okay, so this is glucose. What is this little star thing here? ATP. So anytime we see that, typically it just means high energy. If you look carefully at this glucose, there's a phosphate that's attached on. That's what this little light gray thing is right here. So if this loses a phosphate, which it does, what does it become? What's the other letter? DP. Okay, so D is for di, meaning there's 2 phosphates. T is for tri, which is 3, so it loses 1. Okay, so it goes from ATP to ADP. Now it goes through a couple of chemical changes, and each one of these involves an enzyme. Each one of them is a different compound. We're not going to name them, though, this time. We're just going to focus on the key events. So what's this going on right here? ATP. Notice you have to spend some ATP in order to get this process going. It'd be like, let's say you want to make some interest in the bank. All right, if you went to the bank and you loaned them no money, would you make any interest? Or if you went to the stock market and you bought no stock, could you make any money? No, you got to invest some money in order to make money, and that's kind of what's going on right here. You have to invest some energy in order to make energy, so you got to spend 2 in order to move this process forward. Now what you do get, and this is something that should look familiar, you get G3P. Where have we seen that before? Photosynthesis. All right, that was one of the products that came out of the Calvin cycle. So we see that term again. That's glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. That's what this is right here. A very versatile molecule. Now this is going to be where electrons start getting taken off of the sugar that's getting broken down so that they can be used later on. Because remember, water was what provided electrons in photosynthesis. It's going to be the glucose, the food that you're eating, that provides the electrons for our cells. So, that's NAD+. Get rid of the H. And it gets turned into NADH. Okay, so that's carrying electrons. Another thing to point out here is you have 2 molecules of these 3 carbon compounds. They both turn into G3P, and so you see a little 2 right to the left of this. That indicates there's 2 of these. So we get 2 NADHs that form. Now down here, what do you suppose is going on? Correct. All right, ADP makes ATP. So now we're starting to get some return on our money, if you want to think of it that way. We're beginning to tear apart this molecule, pull the phosphates off, and you're making energy. Notice you get 2 ATPs because there's 2 molecules at that step. Go a little bit further down. What do we see happening again? Got it. You make more. Okay, so we go ADP to get ATP. So what ends up happening is you end up getting 4 ATPs, but you had to spend 2. So what's the total amount of new ATP that got created off this process? Yeah. All right, so we're going to go, I'm going to put that down because this is going to be in your worksheet and it'll just help you answer that. Sorry. All right, we're going to put 4 ATP. And we're going to use a term you might be familiar with. If any of you have had to go out and collect a paycheck, you'll notice that what you get paid per hour is not what you actually get on your paycheck. Where does some of your money go? Taxes, other programs. So I'm going to put what you net, and so what your net pay is what you actually get paid. So here we made 4 ATP, but we had to spend 2, so we get 2 net ATP. Okay, so we don't get 4 totally because we had to spend 2 to make it happen. You also get NADH out of this deal, so you get some electron carrying substances. And then at the end, we form pyruvate, which is spelled Pyruvate. I'll spell it here. And then go ahead and down here, type pyruvate. All right, so you get 2 pyruvates. Actually, I'll put the numbers in parentheses here. This may or may not be important. The ATP is. We're always interested in how much energy you're making. Okay, so we take glucose and break it down to pyruvate. So what the cells are going to begin to do, there's lactose that's in milk. And so if you know anyone who's lactose intolerant, if you're lactose intolerant, you know lactose really well. The bacteria are going to take that, they're going to break it down, they're going to make pyruvate, but then there's no oxygen, so they make lactic acid in order to stay alive. And those bacteria, when you eat yogurt, they're still alive. What happens, do you suppose, when they hit your stomach? Probably die off. But some people say if you eat yogurt, that some of that bacteria ends up in your intestine and it's good for you. I don't know if that's completely true or not. It may or may not be. Okay, but I would think the acid of your stomach's pretty strong. It'd be tough for them to survive that, but not impossible. Okay, so pyruvate's what you get out of that. Go ahead and go to Krebs. Again, we're going to do the highlight reel on this one. This is the 3-carbon compound we just labeled. What is it called? Pyruvate. And you don't have to have it all capitalized, but caps is on, I'm going to leave it. That's pyruvate. Now what happens here, you might be able to figure out what's kind of going on, but that's NAD+, becomes NADH. So what happens is when you take electrons off of something, those electrons can do work. And so NADH is carrying those electrons. Much like copper wire carrying electricity, that kind of thing, to your phone or to your TV. Now there's something that comes off and you're breathing it out right now at this point. Because you had 3 carbons, right now we're down to 2. It goes off as carbon dioxide. That's actually a capital 2. Can't type that, hold on. CO2. Okay, and then from there you have enzymes, just kind of like the Calvin cycle with Rubisco. You have a different type of enzymes called coenzyme A that puts things in. Now you're going to go through, and those carbon atoms are attached onto a 4-carbon compound that already exists. We're not going to worry about naming any of those. We just want to see what happens. So it goes through a chemical change, and then what you'll see from this step to this step is it loses a carbon. So what is it going to be lost as? CO2. So we're starting to tear the molecule apart. By tearing it apart, we can harvest the electrons from it. What do you suppose goes right here? Yep, we're going to pick up an electron as we tear it apart and transfer it to this molecule, and it becomes NADH. Now you go from 5 to 4. Where does that carbon go? CO2. Okay, so each one of these you're going to see as it begins to break down or as a chemical change occurs, you can use those electrons. So you can take NAD+, go to NADH, and just keep in mind NADH is what's carrying electrons. They're going to do work later. Okay, down below, so all these have names. We're not going to worry about the names. There's an interesting one that happens down here. We have one called GDP, and it makes GTP. Does that look like anything we've messed with earlier here today? Yeah, ATP and ADP. In DNA, there's adenine, guanine, cytosine, thymine, ATGC. This is a different nitrogen base, but it functions pretty much the same. Now notice it carries a phosphate, and a phosphate gets transferred down here to make what we should be familiar with by now, ATP out of ADP. So it's a little side reaction that takes place to get to that point. Okay, so each step, we're taking energy off of these molecules and using them. Okay, to here, this is a new one, so you won't know what it is, but you take FAD, which is kind of like NAD, and you make what's called FADH2. Okay, then we move to the next step, so we take an electron off. This is going to be NAD, to make NADH. Okay, and as we come back around, these carbon atoms are going to be recycled. They're going to have 2 more attached to them again. So let's just quickly go through and account for what we've got. How many ATP did we make here? 1 here. Okay, only 1. Now this cycle, do you guys remember how many pyruvates there are that were made in the last one? 2. All right, so we're just going to put results. Hopefully this makes sense to you later, times 2. So in other words, everything we list here, multiply it by 2. So we got 1 ATP, which means we get a total of 2 out of this cycle. How many NADHs do you count? 4, which would be a total of 8. How many FADH2? 1. Here, I'll make that bigger. There we go. Now we could count CO2, but it really doesn't make a huge difference here. It's a waste product. These are the key things that you're getting out of this reaction. Now we're going to see what we do. So we've gotten 2 ATP out of Krebs, 2 ATP out of glycolysis. We've gotten 4 so far, which isn't many. The next one's going to produce 32. This is where you get the majority of your energy. So you can take this sheet. You're done with it. That's all we're going to do with that one. Now let's go to electron transport. I hope that I didn't delete that. I might have. All right, I ought to start a new one. It'll work out fine. By the way, which one would win? Depends on what kind of race you have, right? If it's a short race, this one wins. What if it's a distance race? And you can only fill up once. Then this one wins. Yeah, there's always. We're talking about this in biology. There's always, in honors biology, there's always a trade-off. If you make one thing better, you usually have to decline the activity of something else, and that's what goes on every single time. Just like your shoulder. Think of how all the flexibility your shoulder has and all the range of motion it has. What's the trade-off, though, for having all that flexibility? Extremely weak, right? Which means it's easy to injure. Knees, all right? The knees work really well for an upright walking organism like us. However, they're not extremely strong and they're prone to injury as well.
Yeah, give it a shot. Don't do it. Don't do it.
So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to pull in a picture. I got to see which. I've done a couple of screenshots here. This must be the one here. Yep, this is it. So you should have a page that looks like this. We want to go through and just label the parts. And it's just easier in PowerPoint to make all the arrows and everything. So that's why I'm going to run it. Since I can't write on my TV, or at least easily write on my TV. I suppose I could write on it, but it wouldn't come off very easily. All right, I'm going to use a block arrow because I can type in them. All right, let's start with just a couple of things. Let's go with the very edge, which is called the outer membrane. Okay, and then we're going to point to kind of the gray area on the inside. That's going to be called, and this is one word, intermembrane space. Oops. I'm going to point to the very edge of the darker gray squiggle on the inside there. This one's going to be called the inner membrane. We know it as the crista from yesterday. You might not remember that, but that's what it is. And for those of you that have seen the movie, that's what I think about every time we work with this. The very inside is called the matrix. the matrix of the mitochondria. Now below we're going to see how all the stuff that the Krebs and glycolysis, how that works. This is all taking place. So I'm going to borrow this arrow. I'm going to bring it down here. You guys can just label it. This whole membrane is called the inner membrane or the crista. So this is a section of this folded membrane that's shown above. So everything takes place in here. This should look a lot like light reactions of photosynthesis. There's a reason we spent a ton of time. So what we're going to do, we're going to add some things here. We're going to see what all this NADH and FADH2 do. Okay, so go and type NADH, FADH2. So these are the things that were made in glycolysis and Krebs. And what they get turned into, so I'm going to use an arrow again here. They get turned into two things. So I'm going to use two arrows here. I'm just going to kind of split them off. Yeah, let's do that. That looks fine. All right, what we're going to get out of this, we're going to get H+. Okay, so we get protons. Or what do you suppose the other thing is that we get? Single letter, but it has a minus sign on it. Yeah, electrons are going to get E negatives. So remember we said everything's coming down to where the electrons are being stripped off of it. Now what happens is these are all electron carriers, and what do electron carriers do? What's an electron carrier do? Carries electrons, that's all you need to know. Electron is going to move, so I'm just going to use the scribble here. It's going to move through the electron carriers, and when it does, things happen, which we'll show here in a second. Yeah, just draw a line. So from the electron right here, so I can just kind of connect it a little bit. Right, the electron's going to go through these electron carriers, and eventually it's going to exit out over here when it combines with another chemical. During that time, that electron has energy, and that energy is going to be used to pump protons to the other side of the membrane. So what you're going to do is put an H+ like over here, and then write one underneath each one of these big gray globs. Okay, so you got a whole bunch of hydrogens. Those hydrogens are going to move through these electron carriers. And so the way I'm going to show that, I'm going to run an arrow through. Notice it crosses paths with my electron path right here. And that's to show that it requires some of the energy of that electron to be moved across this membrane. So I'm just going to show an H+ going through up here. And then what I'm going to do, I just want to repeat that because this thing repeats on each one of these electron carriers. So that's basically what's going on there. So you get a whole bunch of hydrogens that get moved to one side. Now the other thing, anyone remember what takes the electrons? You're breathing it in right now. Oxygen. And if you remember in the case of cyanide poisoning, it stops this process right here. So what you get is you have two H+, which are out here, and then a half of oxygen. So it should look familiar kind of from photosynthesis. And what you end up making when that electron combines with it is H2O. I'm specifically moving what I've typed out here so that the electron goes right to this arrow, because I want to say it takes an electron as well to combine with these other two to make water. And if that electron stops and it doesn't move anymore, this whole thing shuts down. One more thing that we got to show. Okay, these H+, they're going to move through this thing. Anyone remember what this thing is called? Looks like a mushroom. Makes ATP. ATP synthase. And I'm going to grab an arrow again, but this time it's going to be going the opposite direction as the other ones. So as that hydrogen passes through the ATP synthase, it has energy. It's moving from high to low concentration. It's called chemiosmosis, which was a term on your crossword puzzle that was hard to find. Okay, as that moves through, it generates the energy that's needed for ATP. So we need to just quickly show that, and then this will be the last thing we need to do.
7th grade boys basketball players are now dismissed.
All right, so we got ADP makes ATP, and it uses the energy of this hydrogen in order to do that. So I'm just going to kind of cross it over right there. This happens, so remember you got quite a few NADHs, you got some FADH2s that are coming in from a single glucose. The number of glucose, all we're going to put is how many ATP we get per glucose. 32 ATPs.